Hey guys, I've got a follow-up on our deck of cards project after seeing what some people have turned in and after seeing what other people have asked about. I got a few tips. The idea is we want to make a program that prints 2 of hearts, 3 of hearts, 4 of hearts, and then all the way to ace of hearts, and then it goes to the diamonds, and then it goes to the clubs and the spades. And it's going to do 52 lines of a deck. And the place I left off in my last video was this. We've got 3 lines, very simple, and it prints 52 lines. And it's a good start of what we're going for because it's got 13 in this group, and then it starts over, and it's got 13 in this group. Now, the only thing wrong is that it doesn't look pretty. It doesn't have, the king and the queen, and it doesn't say hearts or clubs. But it's still doing the basic idea, and we just want to add that design and put the right clothes on it before it goes. We're backstage. We got to put the costume on the actor before we push him out. So how could we do that? Well, first of all, there's not one right way. There are always infinite right ways, theoretically, but some might be simpler than others. One thing I've seen people do, and one thing I've even recommended people do, is you can start with if statements. You could say like, if rank equals 11, then rank equals jack. Okay, because remember we got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Those actually keep their names. If you're playing cards, the 3 is a 3. It doesn't get a fancy, character or whatever. So I could say, well, the 11, it does get a K. It's called a jack. We never say 11, even though it counts as 11 because it's one more than a 10 and it goes in order. It still counts as that, but it puts on the costume of the jack. So if I hit run, now I get the same thing, but every suit has one thing called a jack, and that's pretty good, right? You could do that for the next guy and say, hey, if it's 12, which is one more, we can call that a queen. And I could get basically 8 cards away from perfect because every suit has the 2 through 10. It has a jack and queen, but you might realize, hey, we're out of spaces because after the queen, it starts on the next one instead of having 2 more. We had to have the king and queen still to go. And the reason is because it's got 2 at the beginning that we're not really using. 2 is where we start in a deck of cards. It's the lowest one. I mean, in some games, ace counts as low, but usually it's put at the top. And so we want to have these guys out of here. We don't want to turn this into a king and turn this into an ace because then they'll be out of order. And that would make it look weird now, but also later if we end up using this as a basis of a game and you wanted to see, is king higher than a 5 or something, we want the answer to be yes, and that's hard to do when it's down here instead of over here. Also, if you wanted to see if there was a straight, you'd want them to be lined up instead of comparing things that are all over the place. So you might say, hey, I can't do 13 equals king because there is no 13. So how am I going to do that? You might say, well, I want to change the range. Instead of going from 0 to 13, which by the way doesn't include it, it stops at 12. I could go from 2 to 15. And so I could say, hey, I'm going to start at 2, which is what we want, and then go up to, whenever you use range, it doesn't hit the last one. It stops before. It's like if you're doing a graph and you do that little hollow circle that's not filled in, on a number line or something. I think it's called exclusive instead of inclusive. I think I might be remembering something from math class on that. You might want to do that and then say if it's 14, it's an ace, blah, blah, blah. And that'll get us part of the way there. But then you might realize, hey, this is a lot of lines. This is a lot of stuff. I thought computers were supposed to save us time. And then if you have to do that for the suits, if you want to say like, oh, if it's 0, then it's a club, you know, that would work, but we'd end up adding 8 or 9 lines and making the thing 4 times as much as it started, and that's really ugly. We must be able to do better than that, right? And yeah, we can. I've seen, I think 2 people use another technique, so I'm going to mention that now. I'm going to delete this real quick. I'll keep the 2 to 15 thing. I've seen some people use another idea, which I don't remember if it's been mentioned in your CodeHS, but it will soon. And it's really simple, so don't worry that I'm throwing in something new here, because it's going to be like symbols you've seen and ideas you can easily incorporate. There's this thing in Python called sequences, and you can put stuff in a group and then wrap it up with parentheses or brackets. We'll get into the differences later, because there are lists, there are tuples, there are a couple different kinds of sequences that often work the same way. I might accidentally say list because it's just a normal English word when I really mean tuple or something else, but let's see an example of it. Let's say before we started I want to make the suits, and I'm going to go, we got clubs, put a comma, we got spades, put a comma, we got diamonds, and we got hearts. And I can't do that quite yet, but if I put, actually it might work without it, but I'm going to put parentheses around it. And that technically makes this thing a tuple, which is a list of things that doesn't change. You couldn't add one later, you couldn't take away one, which is fine, because in a deck of cards you don't do that. If I put brackets around it, it would be called a list instead, and that means we could add, another suit in the middle of the game. Not that that would happen. So I'm going to go back to the tuple real quick, but I might accidentally say list, and it's fine. And then you could, I'm hitting run to make sure I don't have errors before I make a big change. Instead of saying range 4, you can just say suits. And now, hey, for a new guy in this list, we're going to go through one at a time. So if I hit run there, then that's pretty beautiful. It says all of one, all of another, all of blah, blah, blah. And I don't have to keep track of where I am or anything. It knows what it's going to do. Which, by the way, I can take off the str here, because now they are strings. It was never an integer in the first place, so I can just do that. I saw one person make the tuple and then still use range, and like use that as the index, like this. When I put this thing in brackets, that means we're going to that spot on the list. So it's like, oh, if we're on 3, then we go to the third one or something. That would work, but it's not necessary. You can cut all this, and just say we're going through this guy. So that works. For the rank, it's a little uglier. If you wanted to make a list of ranks, you would have to say like 2 and then 3 and then 4, blah, blah, blah. And you'd have to type a bunch, and then you'd have to make them strings, or you wouldn't have to. You could do some integers and then some strings, but it would be weird. And if, as I said, if we were going to use this later to play a game, you would want to have the numbers in there. Like, what does a king translate to if we're trying to determine whether it's higher than a 5? You don't want to have to tell the computer, hey, by the way, king's higher than a 5. You just want to say, hey, pretend it's like a 13, and then translate it to a king at the last moment before we display. So for that, I might not go with that. I might go back to the ifs and just do a couple. If rank is 11, turn it into a jack. Okay. By the way, if you're thinking about the loop idea, when it goes to the next one, you might be like, hey, is it going to mess it up if I say this is a jack and then it tries to do +1 to go to the next loop? No, it doesn't matter. When you say range, it creates the whole list right at the beginning, and then it just goes to the next one, no matter what happened to the current one. As you can tell, I just said the word list when it's probably a tuple loop. Who cares? That doesn't matter. You can mess with the variable inside the loop, and it doesn't do any damage. So I might do this for the cards, and we'll think about it. Whenever we actually make a game, which I'm sure we will, you might want to make War or Poker or something like that, then you'll need to have the number values still in there. Like an ace will have to be a 14 sometimes, not just the letter, not just the character ACE, you know. So I would think about that, but this is one way to do it. I've seen, I guess you could say I've seen 3 ways so far. One is people doing if statements. One is doing the tuples and putting them in the range. One person did the tuples and still had the range and then used the index, but that's a little unnecessary. And guess what? There are plenty of other ways. There are ways that involve making a class or making a function or other things we haven't covered. And even using the stuff we have, there are always ways to rearrange it. I mean, you could use while loops. It would be longer. But what the heck? You could do this with while loops just as a challenge or as an experiment to see what happens. You could do lots of different things. So always remember that there's not an answer out there that we're trying to reach. There are a zillion answers, and we're going to find one. And then you still keep in mind that we can definitely turn it into a better one. You might make a program that works perfectly, and then later you want to add a new feature, and then you realize, oh, we got to go back and change stuff we have to make it easier on this new feature. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you were wrong in the first place. It doesn't mean the new feature is bad. It just means we're changing, we're evolving to our situation, or maybe we're just learning something we didn't know earlier. The way I would do a deck of cards, if you told me to, would be to make a class called card. A class is something we'll get to soon, and then it'll have certain attributes and certain functions, which is very pretty to me, but it takes up a lot more memory than doing it with something like this. So everything has pros and cons. Don't worry about that. Good job so far. The ones that I've had turned in and the questions I've got were all people who are really trying and thinking, and the only way to do wrong is to just do nothing and get a 0. I hope we don't have too many of those. Thanks.